Eric,
Omar.
we are back.
Oh, in many ways, yes.
We totally didn't just try to record this episode and have some internet issues, so we're recording it again because the powers that be, which will not be named, are trying to prevent us from dropping this very episode, folks.
They don't want it out, but here's the good news, Omar. Originally, your internet crapped out, and then mine did. And so that way, we are both blameful and blameless. So it's good for us, I think,
Yes.
that no one's pointing the finger, everyone's screwed, and we're going to do our best.
Yeah, it's one of those, I don't even know if this is an actual saying. When you point your finger, you got three pointing back at you. So does that mean you're 3 times as responsible? I'm not sure. Don't even know if that's a real saying. But you want to know what I know to be real, Trex. We've been known for the Hour of Power, the Hour of Power episode. And we're going to introduce something new today, which is probably going to be the 50-minute episode. So it's 10 minutes shorter, but it's 10 times. I'm saying it's 10 times as good as the Hour of Power.
It's all about episode density, and you will find no more density than this.
Yeah. And that's, once again, definitely not because we tried to record this episode and there were internet issues. It's just because we know we could keep this episode succinct and convey everything you need to know. But before we do that, we want to keep the intro also relatively brief. I want to read, Trex, however, a review that you definitely haven't heard, did not just hear 15 minutes ago, that is a 5-star review.
Well, there you go. That's a good start.
Yep. It's Nikki Lifts. It's 5 stars. Thank you, Nikki, for leaving the review. And it says, came for the info, stayed for the banter. As a new convert to the Iron game, I have been enjoying the podcast immensely. The back catalog is full of evergreen topics, engaging banter, and interesting guests. I especially love the episodes that focus on female lifters. Respect. My favorite feature of older episodes is knowing we live in a 2 Eric, 1 Omar triumvirate future, but hearing Helms and Omar from the past occasionally want to talk about Trexler and his work, but having to razz Trexler first for daring to be named Eric, have a PhD, and study sports science. As long as they keep putting out episodes, I will continue to listen. Respect, Nikki. Your reaction, Trex?
My reaction is, I thought most of that was good. If I like to give constructive feedback, do a bit of a sandwich, start with something good, then get a little bit critical. There was mention of the back catalog, which does come up sometimes, not often, for reasons that we can get into if you'd like.
Yeah.
Every now and then people refer to this series of episodes. I think you guys did like a dozen or so before I joined as a permanent host. It's something like that. I don't know. Who's counting? Certainly not the listeners. But anyway, I don't necessarily view the backlog as part of the Iron Culture canon.
Right.
Which doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't exist. I just think it's really important to separate that out and understand as a listener or a viewer that those episodes weren't necessarily Iron Culture putting its best foot forward. It took some time to get up and rolling. We've seen this with classic television shows. Seinfeld was a great example. Took them a couple seasons to get in the groove. Always Sunny in Philadelphia, always good from the start, but very much found its own voice several seasons in. And I appreciate you and Eric for kind of exploring the space and making all the mistakes so I didn't have to. And then by the time I came in as a full-time host, we had a beautiful thing going. And I think to kind of put another nice layer on the other end of that sandwich, I will give you and Helms credit. One bright spot of the alleged back catalog that people talk about, I was on the show a couple times, which I got to give you credit for having that kind of foresight and kind of having that eye for talent. And so that is one bright spot that I'd like to end on and say, I hope that future reviews don't bring too much attention to that back catalog. It's something we kind of tried to move past for a lot of different reasons. But nonetheless, I appreciate the support and credit to you and Helms for getting it right eventually.
Fresh, the only thing I will say in response, because now I'm channeling my inner Helms, is that perhaps Iron Culture is sort of like Seinfeld, but also Curb Your Enthusiasm in the sense that the through thread is Larry David. So it's not a spiritual successor, but the creative minds behind both had 2 very similar, and you could put it kind of broadly under the same umbrella, even though stylistically there are certainly differences. And so it's not to say which one is better, but simply the fact that there are two different, very distinct flavors that follow, a similar contour, so to speak. And it's up to the viewers to pick which one they prefer.
Well, that makes it sound like you're calling what the thing you used to do. If you're calling that Seinfeld, then
I
we
like
might.
her. So I'm going to tell you this.
I no, I'm not comparing the two.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that's maybe a fight for a 2-hour episode,
Nice.
more so than a 50-minute. But no, I think being serious, love the feedback from our dear listeners. Appreciate the support always, and so humbled to be part of the club here, part of the cult.
No, Trex, as always, we are thankful to have you. The joining of Trex Nation, Trex Army, Trextopia, and now this is a Trex focused episode. Trex, you've kind of hinted before that you're somewhat of a caffeine skeptic, maybe. And there's something you want to talk today about the effects of caffeine in relation to performance, whether it be at morning or night. And this might be the reason why we've had internet issues, because they, big caffeine, capital C, doesn't want you to know. Maxwell House, okay, the coffee brand, Folgers, they're coming after us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the thing about caffeine is there's so much money to be made. I mean, if you get, you can buy like a 20-kilogram bag of caffeine powder for like $6, but they want to protect those $6. Yeah. They want to protect those.
Right.
No, it's interesting because I am something between a caffeine lover and a caffeine addict, so to speak. I mean, I do consume. There was a time there where I tried to kick the caffeine fully. That was an interesting experiment, but I'm a weak man. So I'm back. I have caffeine in the morning for just to enjoy my morning and savor that delicious treat in the morning. But so I'm not a caffeine hater by any means, and I'm constantly surrounded in my home by just like empty cans of like cold brew coffee and stuff. So I like caffeine as a human being, but I have become, I think, a bit of a caffeine skeptic as it pertains to fitness applications and kind of the reputation that caffeine has garnered within the fitness world. And I think probably the best example of this is, I've talked about this in various places before, probably on Iron Culture, but I tend to categorize supplements with a tier system, tiers 1 through 5. And tier 1 is the best of the best. It's stuff that works, it's consistent, has an appreciable effect size as far as supplements go. So everything's a small effect size. But when it comes to supplements for lifters, tier 1 is basically just creatine and then protein if you need it to get enough protein in throughout the day. And I've actually gotten a lot of flack. Not a lot. No one really cares that much about my arbitrary tier system. But the flack I've gotten almost always has been, why isn't caffeine up in tier 1?
Yeah.
And I think most people are thinking of, there's been a ton of literature on caffeine. Caffeine has been shown to acutely improve performance, whether we're looking at endurance performance, time trials, time to exhaustion in endurance sport, looking at vertical jump performance, peak power, strength endurance, top end strength, all these different outcomes related to performance. So people are like, well, what gives? It's, there's all these studies out there showing, benefits for performance. But I think my view on caffeine has changed a lot in recent years when you start to dig into, getting away from the potential of caffeine. What can it do on its best day in perfect conditions? When you separate from that and say, right, but then what does that look like in terms of day-to-day usage for a lifter who lives a life that has things other than their morning workout, right? And when you start to get away from research studies that are designed specifically to let caffeine shine, and you start getting more into what we call ecologically valid scenarios that actually represent typical kind of day-to-day usage, caffeine goes from something that is pretty reliable and pretty solid as a performance-enhancing supplement to something that actually may have some times of the day where you might not want to use it for a variety of reasons we'll get into. But it really starts to, that reputation starts to get chipped away a little bit. And you start to say, okay, well, am I actually sure that what I'm seeing on caffeine's best day in those perfect conditions in lab-based scenarios, am I really sure that that's going to translate over to something that's going to help me in a meaningful way as a lifter over the next 8 weeks of training, for example? So the reason that I'm revisiting this topic lately is because in the forthcoming issue of the Mass Research Review, which comes out in a day or two, the cover story I wrote, and the title of my article was, "Does caffeine's ergogenic effect depend on the time of day?" And that's a question that, I'll be completely honest, I had never actually thought about. Which is on me, my bad, because it turns out that that question's been studied before, and this was essentially more of a replication of prior findings. Not a direct replication of any particular study, but kind of reinforcing studies that have been published previously. Now, one of the reasons I haven't thought about this is because if you told me, good news, Eric, you're lifting at 7 p.m., and wouldn't you know it, if I give you 5 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine at 6:30 for your workout at 7, or maybe at 6 for your workout at 7 p.m., we are going to crank out 2 extra repetitions on your first set of your primary exercise. I'd say, no, thanks. I'm good, right? Because for me, I am not sufficiently convinced that cranking out those extra 2 reps on my first set of the exercise and then getting a similar number maybe on the other sets, and that small effect on performance, I'm not necessarily convinced that that's going to do much for me in the long run. And more importantly, I am convinced that me having a massive dose of caffeine at 6 p.m. is going to wreck my sleep. Now, common misconception. A lot of people out there will say, no, Eric, I'm built different, okay? I can drink coffee and go right to sleep. And that may be true, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're out of the woods. So when there's kind of two ways that can backfire and you think you're in the clear. So I've talked to some people who will say, I'm exhausted. It's 4 p.m. I have a cup of coffee and then I just take a nap anyway, and I still fall asleep. Well, your caffeine's going to take before you get like peak levels in the bloodstream, we're talking sometimes 30, 45 minutes, right? So a lot of times what you're doing is you're drinking the caffeine, taking a nap before it reaches peak levels, and then as you're waking up, now, you kind of have more peak levels in the bloodstream. So there's actually a term for that called caffeine naps, which is a fan favorite for sure. I mean, it's the best of both worlds if you're trying to get a little late day surge in energy. So some people kind of fall into that trap where they think just because they fell asleep that they're like unaffected by caffeine, when in reality they fell asleep before peak levels were reached. The other situation is that sometimes people will indeed have a lot of caffeine late in the day and get to bed at a fairly typical time. However, if they were to do like a high-end sleep study where they were actually being monitored physiologically throughout their sleep, we would probably find that their sleep architecture has been altered. So kind of more a nuanced look at the actual quality of the sleep that they're getting. We may indeed find that is interrupted and negatively impacted. And a great example of that is with alcohol, Omar. Now, I used to, in a past life, maybe have a couple beverages and say, man, that stuff puts me to sleep. I still have a little bit from time to time, but as you get older, you start to realize that, like, I don't know, I kind of hate the feeling of even just being buzzed these days, and then you wake up after like a beer and a half and you feel like you got hit by a truck. So I guess that's what, aging is. But anyway, back in the day, I was like, how could alcohol possibly impair my sleep? It puts me out like a baby. But what's interesting about alcohol is that it really messes up your sleep architecture. And while it does have kind of an acute depressive or sedative type effect where it does make you sleepy initially, what we find is that your sleep architecture gets really restructured, and especially the second half of the night, your sleep quality is crap. And so you may find that after you've had maybe a couple drinks, you go to bed and you get to bed quite quickly, but you wake up a few hours earlier than normal. You feel like you're not very well rested. It's because sleep architecture can really be changed even if you don't have issues actually falling asleep at the beginning of the night. So anyway, for me personally, I never really considered using caffeine as a late afternoon or evening supplement for performance because I knew on the back end I'd probably regret that, especially because there was a study within the past couple of years, a meta-regression that was really fascinating. They looked at, how long before bed should you have your last caffeine of the day? And for a long time, people have said 6 hours. And that's been kind of parroted around the evidence-based fitness world for a while now. And that's a misinterpretation. It's a misinterpretation that yielded a misconception, that yielded a heuristic that is super common and popular. Basically, that comes from a study where they looked at different timing of caffeine before bed to see, what's the sweet spot in terms of avoiding impairments in sleep quality. And so they tested multiple different time points of like, here, you have caffeine right before bed. You have it a couple hours before bed. You have it, 6 hours before bed. And what they found was everyone in the study, in every condition, sleep was impaired. So a lot of folks said, oh, well, then the number must be greater than 6 hours because, whether it's like, I think they did 0, 2, 4, and 6 or 0, 3, and 6, one of those two. And so an accurate interpretation of that would be, we don't know what the number is, but it's greater than 6. And in the game of telephone, that got changed to just at least 6, right? And so that's a very, very different interpretation, but a very understandable misinterpretation nonetheless. So this recent meta-regression, they did a really nice job with it, and they looked at, depending on the dose, how far before bed would you want to actually put that caffeine to really confidently feel like you're going to avoid disrupting your sleep quality. So with black tea, a standard dose of caffeine is about 47 milligrams by their estimation. And they said, honestly, if you're only talking about 47 milligrams, probably don't have to worry about it too much. You're not going to get a huge jolt of wakefulness from that type of dose of caffeine unless you're quite sensitive to it. So they said, with that, you probably don't have to worry about timing. And perhaps even a better example is, chocolate. You might find a little bit of caffeine in there, but it's not the type of thing that it even makes sense to worry about in terms of proximity to bed. Now, coffee, they estimated a typical serving is going to give you about 107 milligrams. Now, that's for a cup of coffee. So my understanding, Omar, I'm not a well-traveled man. I'm certainly not a cultured man. My understanding is that in Europe, a cup of coffee is actually approximately a cup. You might get a little 5-ounce thing. In America, a cup is actually like 47 ounces, okay? It's like the big gulp from Speedway. So a lot of folks, I know a lot of people who are like not really into nutrition and aren't well-versed in this stuff. And they're like, well, okay, so I have a cup of coffee. This is like 100 milligrams, and it's like a 16 or 20-ounce cup. And I'm like, dog, that's like 4 cups. Yeah.
Trex, just one quick aside, 100% what you just said. I want to talk about your state of Ohio in the sense that when we were traveling, we did the Arnold this year for Rascal. Anyways, first time I ever experienced this, went to Dunkin' Donuts. One of the few times I'd been there. We have something similar in Canada, cool. But we went and I got a cold brew and I got a medium size, and they said, we're out of medium size like cups. Do you mind if we give you a large one? I said, sure, no problem. Trex, I'm not even kidding you. I thought it was going to be your standard. So medium, as you said, 16 ounce, whatever the amount is. So sure, that's a lot higher than normal, but it's like something I could understand. At least 30. It was like a big gulp. Big gulp. We were all floored. And the person, we won't charge you for it.
It needs a handle because you can't fit your hand all the way around the cup.
Insane. So yeah, sorry, please continue. Where people conceptualize what a cup means, it varies widely depending upon where and who we're talking to.
Yeah, and I think that is so Ohio in November, December, it is a lot like Finland in like October. And it's just like you get into those Scandinavian countries and they're like, no, we drink 600 milligrams of caffeine a day because like it's gray and it's overcast and there's no leaves on the trees anymore. It's just an intense way of being. And I think you get some of that in the Midwest in the winter, like you're going to get that. But anyway, in Midwestern culture, everyone's very polite, but the coffee servings will punch you in the face. So anyway, with a human-sized serving of coffee, which is about 107 milligrams in their paper, They actually say, yeah, you might want to have that maybe at, I think they said around noon, 1 p.m. if you're planning to go to bed around 10 p.m. So we're talking, it's going to be a solid, 9 or 10 hours, I think, but before bed you're aiming for there. Now, they also did one for an estimation for pre-workout supplements. And of course, that's going to vary a lot. But in this case, they said, let's say your pre-workout has about 217 milligrams of caffeine in it. They said for that one, if you want to go to bed at 10 p.m. and you want to be pretty darn confident that that you're not going to impair your sleep quality, you probably ought to be having that. I think they said at about 9 a.m. or so. I'm pretty sure the number was 13 hours before bed, which basically, the way that I've interpreted that and the way I've actually applied that, because like I said, the study was really well done, this meta-regression. My coffee consumption happens early in the day. So I usually wake up around 4 in the morning, and my first serving of coffee is in my system by 4:15. Not because it necessarily has to be, but it is 4 a.m. So I'd sure like to get it in now. It's an emergency every day. But also, if you are someone who's going to be, maybe your total daily intake for the day is going to be in excess of 200, 300 milligrams. Yeah, you probably want to make sure that you're really front loading that in the day to make sure that you're going to give your body time to clear that out before bed. Did you want to interject there? No? Okay, cool. So anyway, for those reasons, I'd never really looked into this question too terribly closely because frankly, it doesn't, to me or to anyone I coach, it's not going to change how I view it. But I do think it's really fascinating to dig into the results of this study. So in my Mass article, I reviewed this paper by Bugreen and colleagues. It was called The Effects of Different Caffeine Dosages on Maximal Physical Performance and Potential Side Effects in Low Consumer Female Athletes, Morning versus Evening Administration. Continuing the trend of long titles in academic texts, I expect that to continue in perpetuity for the remainder of time. But basically, a really, really cool study that they were doing here. And there was two kind of variables moving in this study. So they were interested in looking at the timing of caffeine supplementation and how that impacted performance. So taking it in the morning versus taking it in the evening. So the morning condition was 8 to 9 a.m. is when the dose was taken, and then the evening was 6 to 7 p.m. So very much like a morning workout versus getting a workout after work or after school for the day, right? Now on top of that, they were also interested in the dosage because I think a very practical question would be, okay, I've heard caffeine's great. I want to use any ergogenic aid that I can. But maybe I can get away with using it in the evening if I use a smaller dose, right? That's intuitive, I think. So they had morning and evening supplementation. They also had 3 different conditions. One was a placebo, so no caffeine. One was 3 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine, which is like the low end of what we consider the ergogenic range. And then they also had a higher dose caffeine condition, which was 6 milligrams per kilogram, which typically is what we call the higher end of the ergogenic range. Usually, if you go much higher than that, you're going to start to see a higher frequency of side effects in studies. Nothing too major, but people will get headaches, they'll get jittery, they'll notice that maybe they have a little bit of what we might call in the medical world, Omar, tachycardia or an elevated heart rate, dropping the medical terminology. So 6 different conditions: morning placebo, morning 3 milligram, morning 6 milligram, evening placebo, evening 3 milligram, evening 6 milligram. And so, participants completed all 6 of those. So this was a totally crossover within subjects type design. And they looked at a bunch of different performance outcomes related to like power output, like counter movement jump. They looked at some repeated sprint testing, whole bunch of different stuff in the realm of power and kind of the ability to maintain power over repeated bouts. And the results can be summarized. If you want to get the real details and get into the nitty gritty results, I definitely encourage you to check out that Mass article when it becomes available. But you can actually summarize it pretty concisely in terms of the general overview. First of all, point number 1 is that morning performance was typically worse than evening performance. And that's not even talking about caffeine, just in general. And that is actually really consistent in the literature. Now, if you work out in the morning, don't worry, because there's a caveat here. If we take folks who normally work out in the afternoon and we say, guess what? You work out in the morning now. For some stretch of time, weeks, not months, their performance is going to slip a little bit. There's a bit of a neuromuscular deficit, that's the term they often use in the literature, where you just got to adjust to it. It takes a little bit of time before you can really, replicate your afternoon or evening performance level as you're transitioning into morning workouts. So that was observed in this study, and that's not surprising at all. People do tend to have a slight performance deficit in the morning until they get used to training in the morning, and then you can do just as well in the morning as the afternoon or evening. Now, point number 2 is that higher dose caffeine was generally better than the lower dose. So 6 milligrams was better than the 3 milligram per kilogram dose. But the interesting thing is that this higher dose caffeine in this study, it restored morning performance to a level that was similar to evening performance. So basically, your performance when you came in and did morning workout plus 6 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine was similar, but not better than your performance for the evening workout plus placebo. So we are not, if you really want to get about, into the semantics here, we're not really talking about a performance improvement. We're talking about a performance restoration to baseline. You're overcoming this early morning deficit in terms of basically you are papering over a performance impairment and just getting back to normal, so to speak. Again, with the high dose caffeine, but not with the lower dose. And then the third point that helps kind of summarize these findings is that caffeine did not meaningfully improve evening performance. The effects were not statistically significant, nor were they practically significant. So to me, one of my big kind of refrains in this article that I keep going back to is that this paper is not the first to find this, the idea that caffeine as an ergogenic aid, even if we forget about sleep, acutely, caffeine seems to be more effective in the morning than it is in the evening for performance. Now, the reason that people haven't been really picking up on this trend much is the reality is the vast majority of caffeine research for performance happens in the morning. And there's a million practical reasons for why that would be. So when you look at these huge meta-analyses that say, oh yeah, caffeine works time and time and time and time again, it's one of the dangers of when a body of research kind of inherently falls into this same paradigm that has assumptions built in that we don't actually think about or challenge. Like, of course, if you're going to do a performance study with caffeine, you're probably going to do that testing in the morning. That's when people have their caffeine. It makes all the sense in the world. Usually, research participants like to come in the morning before work or school rather than, coming in the middle of the day or after. So, yeah, it makes sense that we would have this huge body of research that is incredibly biased toward testing in the morning. And bias there is not a pejorative. It's not a bad word. It's just that's how it is. You're going to do a caffeine study in the morning. So a lot of folks haven't really picked up on the trend that caffeine doesn't seem to be as effective in the evening because there just aren't as many studies that even try, and certainly very, very, not very many at all that actually look at that question very specifically. But this is not the first study that has indicated that caffeine works better in the morning than the evening, which actually is a really interesting, there's another layer to that, right? When we start digging into what assumptions are built into the caffeine literature that we haven't really zoomed out and thought about, I think you can make a strong case that much of the caffeine literature, if not most, is observing performance when people are actually experiencing a performance deficit from being, typical afternoon or evening exercisers who are dragged into the lab, earlier than they normally train. And so I do wonder, if not suspect, that, there's kind of my two different levels of confidence there. I'm not sure how far out on the limb I'm willing to go, but I think you can make a very credible argument that much of what we've seen in the literature in terms of the ergogenic effect of caffeine is really overcoming the performance deficit of training super early in the morning, way earlier than you normally exercise. And I think that's kind of a huge deal when it comes to the practical application of caffeine, because then you start to say, okay, well, in a practical sense, what is caffeine actually good for? Like, what is the actual use case for caffeine? And you could say, well, this shifts our perspective a little bit. If we take this finding, which has been found previously, at face value, then we would not say caffeine is this, tier 1 supplement that if you're gonna train, take it beforehand no matter what, and there's no downsides. It actually becomes a much more nuanced kind of specialized application. So maybe you say, I use caffeine before workouts to facilitate the transition when I'm switching from afternoon workouts to morning workouts, and I want to have a little bit of a crutch to ease that transition without eating a performance decrement when I'm making that transition. So it's kind of a short-term bridge supplement to help ease that transition from later workouts to earlier workouts. So that's an important way to recontextualize one use case of caffeine. And before we get into the others, Omar, if you have any questions about that study, of course, fire away. But I want to talk about some other elements of caffeine supplementation that actually kind of weaken the argument to treat it as a kind of no-brainer supplement for lifters.
So Trex, that is very interesting. I think the only point that I would want to raise, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, I haven't had a chance to review your article, is I assume you're going to say when one supplements with caffeine in the evening, that what might happen, what they observe, compared to those that supplement with it in the morning, is that over time, due to the effect of caffeine on sleep quality, that you would maybe notice a performance decrease, and that is probably why it could be superior. Using it in the morning when you are deprived, of sleep and your performance is affected, as opposed to just simply put, in the evening. It's not that it doesn't enhance performance; it's because you're already well rested compared to in the morning when you're not. I thought there's going to be something to do with taking it in the evening and it affecting your sleep quality, and that being one of the differential factors.
No, so in this particular study paradigm, so if you told me, hey, we did a study and, it was an 8-week study and people were taking caffeine daily, some were taking it in the morning, some in the evening, and the folks in the evening, there was this kind of unfavorable impact on their performance over this 8-week span. If you told me that in isolation, I would have assumed that by taking caffeine every night, they were just chronically wrecking their sleep. And ultimately, over that 8 weeks period of time, their performance quality was just kind of degrading as they became, kind of building up this sleep debt, so to speak, from just crappy quality. So that was initially what I thought the study was going to be about when I saw the title. But that's not what happened here. So this was a study where we were talking about acute administration of caffeine in people who are not naive to caffeine, but not like heavy users. So these people are not totally habituated, nor are they totally naive and like potentially hypersensitive to caffeine. And so what they did is like single dose, and before they came in for their next visit to try a different combination of dosage and time, there was at least a 72-hour washout period. So we really are looking at like when you take this in the evening, 3 milligrams or 6 milligrams or a placebo, your performance was pretty much not impacted. So this was, obviously, if you're a statistician listening, hey, the three of you out there, I'm going to get a little loose with the terminology, but in the real world, the term for that is it don't work. But the statisticians are saying, well, they didn't do equivalence testing. Leave me alone. I'm on a fitness podcast. Right? So yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. That's where I thought this study was going when I saw the title. But that is not where it went, which actually makes an even stronger case for caffeine being more of a specialized kind of morning supplement for people that are either underslept or are kind of easing into that transition of becoming a morning exerciser. Now, there are other reasons that I think we have to also question the relevance. Like I said, I always think of a really wonderful umbrella review by Jozo Grgic in the, I think, British Journal of Sports Medicine. There's like this figure burned into my brain, this image, and you see the effect size from all these meta-analyses of caffeine on strength and power and vertical jump and endurance performance. It's a great figure that really shows a pretty overwhelmingly positive view of caffeine. And that paper is done exceptionally well. But I mentioned previously that we have to kind of zoom out and think of like, are we sure that that exact paradigm of research is actually translating over to what we're hoping to get out of caffeine as a day in and day out regular supplement? And so one thing that we have to ask ourselves is, does the acute performance improvement that we're getting from caffeine, does that actually make us stronger over time? Does that actually make us beefier over time? So does that little, few extra reps here and there actually translate to getting bigger and stronger over the course of a longer training period? And there's actually, it's really surprising to me, but despite caffeine's reputation as this well-studied supplement, there's so much low-hanging fruit with the caffeine research that just hasn't been touched or hasn't been addressed nearly enough to feel like we have conclusive answers. So there is not a lot of research saying, hey, you know how caffeine improves your performance today? Does that matter for 4 weeks or 8 weeks or 16 weeks? We have very little research actually addressing that. The few studies that you could argue kind of get at it are actually with pre-workout supplements that have creatine and citrulline and beta-out. They're just completely confounded by this kind of like shotgun approach to throwing everything in the kitchen sink into these formulas. And for good reason, if you're going to do a pre-workout, make it, put the stuff in there that works. But in terms of just caffeine alone, we really don't have a lot of research on that. We also don't have a lot of research on the time course of habituation, withdrawal, and resensitization. So, if you start using caffeine every day, specifically when it comes to performance, are we sure that that acute ergogenic effect doesn't wear off over time? If it does, how long does that take? Is it a complete reduction of the ergogenic effect or only a partial attenuation of that ergogenic effect? If you do that and then stop taking it, how does that withdrawal actually impact your performance? Does it bring you back down to baseline or worse than baseline? If so, for how long? When does the withdrawal period end? And when are you then resensitized and basically a new caffeine-naive user? We really haven't worked that out. And that is not, in my opinion, a hard thing to work out if you've got access to a lab and, a couple sets of hands to run that study. So I've been kind of pleading for years that people start looking into this low-hanging fruit because, hey, if you're a master's student and you need to do a thesis project and you have an isokinetic dynamometer sitting around or a good way to measure vertical jump, you can probably find a way to test an ergogenic effect for strength and power type outcomes in a way that's not going to be fatiguing and you're not going to have issues of doing like repeated daily testing of that performance task. And you could probably get a whole lifetime supply of caffeine for like $9, right? Which as a master's student, it's often hard to fund your own research, not if it's caffeine. And I tell you what, if you plan this study, Omar, I'm going to regret this. I'm feeling generous. I will donate the $9 to make that study happen. Okay. So if you send me the approved IRB for this study, I will send you $9 American crisp in the mail. But anyway, those types of things are really critical for understanding. The question is not, does caffeine work? The question is, in what context is it actually worthwhile to utilize caffeine as a lifting-oriented supplement? So along those lines, I can only think of really one study by Heraldez Costas and colleagues that looked at like, hey, we're going to give caffeine daily before workouts over a multiple week period and see how it actually impacts training adaptations. And honestly, the results were pretty underwhelming. You really don't look at the results and say, wow, good thing they did, that they were using caffeine daily over this 4-week period. In terms of the actual tangible adaptations to that training program, now granted, It's only 4 weeks, so obviously it's tough to really reliably measure substantial performance changes over a short time window like that. But all of that's to say that the research that we have, being minimal and having some limitations, is not very impressive for caffeine as something that's going to improve your long-term adaptations to training versus just giving you an acute little boost of performance today, in an hour after you consume it. Along the same lines, like I said, when it comes to habituation, we are really, in my opinion, sorely lacking for high-quality data, specifically as it pertains to performance. Now, there's some literature with caffeine that looks at the concept of habituation and withdrawal, but it's looking at things like the blood pressure response to caffeine intake or the release of catecholamines in response to caffeine intake, things that, frankly, no one really cares about in the lifting world. We want to know, is it going to improve strength, power, endurance today? And can I keep going back to that well day after day after day and still get an ergogenic effect? Now, here's where it gets tricky. There's some studies that have looked at, for example, I'm thinking of one that looked at performance over like a 21-day period, giving caffeine before workouts kind of day in and day out. And there was some considerable habituation that occurred, an attenuation of that ergogenic effect. What happened, it wasn't a full attenuation, but it was noteworthy. What happens if that's 42 days instead of 21? Does that actually go all the way down to zero? I don't know. We're looking at a fragment of a longitudinal trend there. Now, some people will push back, Omar. I see you with your skeptical face. So people will push back and say, well, Eric, that's dumb. We already answered that question. There is a different approach to that question where people have brought folks into the lab and said, hey, how much caffeine do you normally consume? And some people will say a ton. I'm like Omar. I get the big gulp of coffee every morning. When I'm driving through Ohio, I'm getting like 600 milligrams a day, right? And so they've looked at, can we detect, placebo versus caffeine? Can we detect an ergogenic effect in people who are caffeine naive, people who are moderate users, people who are heavy users, and theoretically, are already habituated to caffeine's effects? And people will say, well, we know that habituation is not a big deal because among people who claim to be heavy, consistent caffeine users, we still see an ergogenic effect. But once again, I would argue we don't really have enough evidence to really definitively declare that that's an ergogenic effect. It could very well be, since we have such little evidence about the effects of caffeine withdrawal on performance and the actual timeline of that effect. When people are doing that kind of research, they often bring in these regular caffeine users and say, okay, before your testing visit, I need you to avoid caffeine for 24, maybe 48, maybe 72 hours. And then we're going to bring you in and test you. And we're going to either give you caffeine or placebo. We're not going to tell you which one. We're going to look at your performance. Then we're going to do that again, 24, 48, 72 hours. We'll bring you in, and this time we'll give you the other one, placebo or caffeine. I am not certain, I'm not even near certain, that in that particular paradigm of research, when we're finding a quote-unquote ergogenic effect for habitual users, I'm very much wondering if we're just finding that their performance sucks when they are deep in the throes of caffeine withdrawal, and the ergogenic effect that we're attributing to caffeine is just overcoming the performance impairment that's being induced by withdrawal when they're in the placebo condition. And so that, to me, is a pretty big deal. So when we zoom out and look at caffeine, I think the kind of broader theme here, as someone who likes to spend too much time thinking about research design and biased research designs and blind spots with the way that we approach answering research questions, I think it's very worthwhile to consider what are the ramifications of caffeine being studied in such a uniform way across all these different parameters of performance. The paradigm is really simple. We bring you in, maybe we ask you how much caffeine you normally have. We say, hey, take it easy for a day or two before testing visits. We're going to give you placebo one day, caffeine the other. I know you normally work out at 3, but why don't you come in at 7 a.m. because that's when the lab's open. get it in before work. And there are potentially some serious ramifications of taking that kind of extremely uniform approach to caffeine research that's been compounding for decades. And there are some blind spots built into that lead to what I would consider kind of inadequately answered questions about caffeine's utility as a day in, day out, everyday type lifting supplement. So in my article, Omar, I kind of lay out a few scenarios where I think it is absolutely easy to justify leaning on caffeine as a performance-enhancing supplement. Okay, so the scenarios I lay out. Number one, I mentioned this already. If you are transitioning from being an afternoon or evening exerciser to a morning exerciser, during that transition period, perhaps it does make sense to say, I'm going to throw some caffeine in the mix and see if we can't attenuate that kind of acute suppression of performance. That makes all the sense in the world to me. Number two, let's say you've got a particularly important workout. For whatever reason, you are in caffeine withdrawal. You used to be consuming it every day. You've been trying to take your foot off the gas a little bit and kind of resensitize to caffeine. But for whatever reason, you're in caffeine withdrawal and you really want to perform well today. I very much believe that a dose of caffeine is going to help overcome any performance impairments that might be associated with that withdrawal. Number three, if you are going into a workout and this particular workout needs to be a good one and you are in an underslept state, maybe you had a few nights of crappy sleep in a row or one night of just really, really crappy sleep. If you really want to rescue performance for that day, then I think caffeine makes sense. But again, I'm not totally certain that we can keep going back to the well. And if you're an afternoon exerciser, you could easily see that becoming a pretty vicious cycle where you're using caffeine because your sleep quality sucks, but you're messing up your sleep quality because you're using caffeine at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. And so you keep going back to that, you're habituating to the caffeine, and you're still disrupting your sleep quality on a fairly regular schedule. I will acknowledge that, someone could push back and say, well, are we sure we don't also adapt and habituate in terms of the negative impact on sleep? I'd probably have to look into that and try to get to the bottom of that. But it's not a gamble I'd put a lot of money on in terms of rolling the dice, so to speak. I think there are major downsides to that, to even initiating that potential cycle that I mentioned. And then finally, another reason to utilize caffeine. And Omar, this is where I win everybody back. We're about to close out the episode here. I put my arms around the audience and I say, hey, everybody, it's okay. The fourth one that I mentioned in my article, justification for treating caffeine as a day in, day out, everyday, regular use pre-workout supplement is if you just like to subjectively improve the enjoyment of your training session. If you like the feeling of getting hopped up on the old caffeine, getting into the gym, laying it all on the line, working up a sweat, and just feeling good, feeling focused, feeling that burst of energy to the extent that you still get it, if you're a regular user, that's completely fine. That's completely justifiable. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. And Omar, I know we're both old enough. Back in the day, it was not banned. You throw a little caffeine, a little bit of that DMAA, the geranium root. Whether it's actually in geranium root, who knows? But let the lawyers figure that out. I'm sure it's still ongoing. But man, back in the day, those pre-workouts, nowadays people say, oh, this pre-workout hits different. And it's like, it doesn't really, But, the ones that it's like, okay, it's caffeine. It hits just like all the other caffeine. But man, back in the day, people got so creative. So I've been there. And, there was a time where you'd get the original formula Jack 3D. And honestly, man, in my lifting circle, I don't think anyone actually cared. If you said, hey, just so you know, a double-blind study came out, that doesn't actually improve your performance. We'd say, I don't care. I'm having a great time, man. I'm loving it. If that's why you like to use caffeine before workouts is because you just love subjectively how it feels, by all means, man, go for it. But rounding it all up and kind of the closing statement here, my final defense of my argument is, I'm not saying people shouldn't use it, but I am saying we should really think about how we contextualize our understanding of caffeine as a supplement. I think the prevailing sentiment with regards to caffeine is that you should use it before every workout. Obviously, it's going to help improve your adaptations to training. Of course, there's going to be no potential downsides. It's a no-brainer. Put it in the top tier. Caffeine's the best. And I think when you really start digging into the literature, you actually start to push up against that a little bit. And you say, well, I mean, if I really needed to work out and just perform my best in exactly 60 minutes today, then yes, I would take it. But when we start looking at it and kind of seeing how it works into that paradigm of being a daily use supplement, we start to see there's actually a lot of gaps in that literature and some pretty credible questions with regards to potential downsides and potential, either downsides or just situations where the performance benefit could simply wear off over time, possibly. So I'm not a caffeine hater, but for the folks that swear by it, I am a bit of a skeptic in the way a lot of people apply it. And ultimately, the reason I wrote this article, Omar, is because I get so many folks who will ask me, because I published a lot of research on caffeine. I get so many folks who will ask me, Eric, I know that caffeine is this super, super effective pre-workout supplement ingredient, but I work out at 6 p.m. and I just can't tell if it's worth it. Should I do the 300 or 400 milligrams of caffeine at 6 p.m.? I don't want to give up this huge, reliable performance benefit, but I also don't want to screw up my sleep. This kind of article really lays out my reasoning for saying, I'd skip it. If I'm working out at 6 p.m., there's potential downsides on sleep. There's all those other considerations about habituation. Does it actually improve our adaptations over time? And then this study adds another wrinkle to that, which is, are we actually sure that this even works when we consume it in the evening? So with all those factors in mind, when people are kind of treating it as a dilemma of whether or not they should be, taking caffeine or not for these late evening workouts, I tend to push back and say, are we sure it's really that much of a dilemma? Is it possible that you're overstating the confidence we have in caffeine as a reliable pre-workout supplement, especially when it's consumed in the evening? And I think when you lay out the evidence, you say, we're really leaning more toward the decision to omit caffeine for late night workouts, but include it if you like it for morning workouts, especially in those scenarios I described.
Trex, this is a phenomenal episode. I'm going to make sure we go underneath an hour just so we can claim what we claimed, that this
break
is
the record.
Not an hour power episode. It's 50 minutes, 10 minutes less, 10 times as strong. Okay. You can hold us to that. But there's two things I do want to say just very briefly. One, I think it's phenomenal where you're basically guiding along potential master students to say, hey, low-hanging fruit, this would be really cool. It'd help out the community. And you're outlining like genuine research that needs to be done in order to fill in the gaps. So I do want to just put some respect on you. And then two, I want your quick thoughts, because when you're giving the use cases for caffeine, the one that immediately became obvious when you outlined, okay, here are the reasons why one can or should use caffeine. I still kind of feel that for powerlifting meets, there could be some benefits. The rationale being that, yes, most powerlifters probably use some amount of caffeine during their training, but I do also know most powerlifters, we need to interview them, but they train probably more towards afternoon or evening, right? They're not going to get their heavy squat, bench, deadlift session in the morning, but as we all know, most powerlifting meets occur in the morning, and most powerlifters will use a heavier dose while they are competing because they feel likely, exactly you said, there's like sort of a sleep debt. They think it's a performance enhancer, but kind of what we're outlining here, it's more that sleep debt can impair performance. And so by using that caffeine, it can offset it. What do you think about just powerlifters for, a use case, those that compete, even if they're not caffeine naive, they're habituated, but do you think that's still a valid use kind of when one competes in powerlifting for a meet?
Definitely. And I think that falls kind of under, or at least in my mind, the way I intended it, kind of falls under two of the examples I gave in terms of justifications. One being you're performing earlier than you normally do in the context of a powerlifting meet. And the other is, if you are habituated, then if nothing else, you just want to make sure you're avoiding any potential performance decrement or deficit from not having caffeine, right? So absolutely, I think it makes all the sense in the world in that scenario. Because with a powerlifting meet, we're laying out, right? This is it. It's today, right? And that's what I said a few times in this episode. Like, if my goal is to be my best performing self in 1 hour at 9:12 p.m. Eastern time, then I'm taking caffeine right now, right? But when we start looking at it as a kind of everyday no-brainer supplement, that's where some of these other considerations start to come into play. But yeah, meet day as a powerlifter, absolutely, that makes all the sense in the world.
Trex, I love it. We're going to end here just because we're 56 minutes, okay? I'm going to make sure we get less than an hour so we get a whole true. People would say we're giving bonus 10 minutes. We say, no, you know what? We're keeping this 50-minute episode. Trex, you're the man. Fantastic episode. All the relevant links will be linked down below in the description. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review. We just read one. It was 5 stars. It had plenty of Trex lore. Typically, people will leave 5 stars. We leave it up to your own discretion, but you understand what we're saying. We're back every single Monday from now until the end of time. We'll see you in that next episode.